When you hear the word Viking, what comes to mind? Perhaps the image of longships cutting through icy seas, warriors with axes in their hands, and the thunder of raids echoing across distant shores. For many of us, the Viking Age is painted in bold strokes, stories of courage, conquest, and the wild spirit of the North. But what if I told you that beneath the roar of battle and the pride of freedom, there was another story running silently in the background? A story of chains, of silence, and of people whose names were not carved into sagas. Tonight, we step into the world of the forgotten Thralls, the slaves of the Vikings. You see, slavery was not a side note in Norse society. It was a foundation stone. The warriors who plundered monasteries in England, the traders who sailed down rivers into the heart of Europe, the farmers who tilled the soil of Scandinavia, all of them existed in a world where slavery was not only accepted, but expected. If you lived during the Viking Age, you either lived as free, fought to remain free, or existed as someone else's property. That was the truth of the world the Vikings built. So who were these Thralls? The word itself comes from Old Norse, Thrall, meaning slave. Thralls were men, women, and children taken in raids or born into bondage. They had no legal rights, no voice, and no choice in their lives. If a Viking family needed extra hands to work the farm, Thralls did the hard labor. If a chieftain needed more household servants, Thralls carried water, prepared food, and tended fires. And if a raiding crew returned from overseas, the human captives they dragged along were often destined for the slave markets, where they could be sold for silver or goods. Let us step back for a moment to imagine a Viking raid on a coastal village in Ireland. The longships arrive at dawn, their sails bright against the horizon. Warriors pour into the settlement, axes flashing, shields banging. Some villagers fight, others flee. But when the smoke clears, the Vikings do not only take gold or livestock, they drag with them men and women, terrified children, their lives ripped from their homes. Bound together, marched to the shore, forced into ships. For those taken, this was not the beginning of a heroic saga. It was the start of a life in chains. And yet, to the Vikings, Thralls were more than just captives. They were a currency. They were a way to measure wealth. A powerful jarl could show his status not only through treasure and warriors, but also by the number of thralls he owned. In fact, for many Viking households, thralls were essential to survival. Farming in Scandinavia was back-breaking work, and the short summers meant every hand mattered. Thralls plowed the fields, cut hay for livestock, and carried out the heavy lifting. They built fences, hauled stones, chopped wood, and kept the wheels of daily life turning. Without them, many farms would simply collapse under the weight of work. But life as a thrall was not equal for everyone. Some lived under harsh masters who beat or mistreated them. Others were treated with a measure of decency, working side by side with free people. Still, the truth remained. They were property. A thrall could be bought, sold, or even killed with little consequence. Their children inherited their status, meaning entire families could live and die without ever tasting freedom. Imagine being born into such a life, never knowing what it meant to make your own choices, your own destiny, your own path. For the free Norse farmer, freedom was his greatest pride. For the thrall, it was an impossible dream. What makes Viking slavery even more striking is how widespread it was. We often imagine the Viking Age as a time of heroic independence, where every man and woman stood proud and free. But freedom was not universal. Some scholars estimate that as much as 10 to 15% of the population in Scandinavia during the Viking Age were thralls. That means for every 10 free people, there might have been 1 or 2 living in bondage. Imagine a Viking village, the proud hall of the chieftain, the fields of the farmers, the quiet huts at the edges. Within those huts lived the Thralls, their lives woven into the community, but never equal, always in shadow. Thralls were not only a part of daily life, they were also a part of death. In some Viking burials, Thralls were sacrificed to serve their masters in the afterlife. Archaeologists have uncovered graves where a nobleman was laid to rest, with weapons, treasures, and sometimes the remains of Thralls who were killed to accompany him. For the Thrall, even death might not mean freedom. It could mean becoming a part of someone else's eternal destiny. And then there was the trade. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were traders, and one of the most profitable trades of the era was human lives. Dublin, for example, became one of the largest slave markets in the Viking world. There, captured men and women were sold, transported across Europe, sometimes as far as the Middle East. Silver, weapons, exotic goods, all could be exchanged for human beings. In this way, Viking thralls became a thread connecting cultures across vast distances, but not in the way they would have wished. They were currency, moved from one land to another, their identities stripped away. The sagas, the great stories written about Viking heroes centuries later, rarely mention thralls in detail. And when they do, thralls appear only at the edges of the story. A servant tending the fire, a worker carrying goods, a nameless presence. Perhaps this silence was intentional. The Norse loved to remember themselves as free and strong, and in that vision, there was little room for the shameful truth that their society rested on unfree labor. It is only through archaeology, through careful study, and through reading between the lines that we glimpse the world of the Thralls. Now, let's pause here and reflect. History often paints the Vikings as symbols of strength, freedom, and wild independence. But behind that image lies the truth that their world, like so many societies in the past, was built on both glory and suffering. The story of the Thralls reminds us that history is never simple. It is never only about the heroes. It is also about those who lived in silence, whose names were not remembered, but whose labor made the world function. Without them, the Viking Age as we know it would not have existed. As we move forward in this story, we will dive deeper into the lives of these thralls, what they ate, how they lived, whether they ever had hope of freedom, and how their existence shaped the Viking Age economy and culture. We will uncover the forgotten markets of Europe where thralls were traded, and we will ask why this history has been left in the shadows for so long. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were also masters. And the Thralls, though forgotten, are just as much a part of the Viking legacy as the ships and the swords. This is where our journey into the hidden side of Norse society truly begins. The Thralls' daily existence was defined by labor, and yet it varied depending on the household and the tasks demanded of them. In the Scandinavian countryside, most thralls were farmhands, performing the grueling work that kept families alive in a land where winters were long and unforgiving. At dawn, before the free farmer rose to inspect the fields, a thrall might already be hauling water from the well, feeding animals, or trudging across damp soil with a heavy plow. In summer, they cut hay and gathered it into stacks that would feed cattle through the cold months. In autumn, they harvested grain, bent-backed for hours until their muscles ached. The rhythm of their lives was the rhythm of the seasons, but unlike the free farmer, they did not reap the rewards of their labor. What they produced belonged to their master. Inside the household, other thralls served as domestic servants. Women often bore the burden of housework, grinding grain into flour, baking bread, weaving cloth, tending the fire. Some worked in the kitchens, cooking meals for families they would never truly be part of. Others became nursemaids to children who would grow up free while their own remained in chains. For these thralls, daily life was a quiet reminder that they lived among, but not within the community. They saw the joys and sorrows of the families they served, but their own lives remained invisible. Yet not all thralls were destined for fields or hearths. Some were skilled artisans or craftsmen, forced to use their talents for their master's gain. A blacksmith taken in a raid might find himself forging weapons in a Norse settlement, his craft enriching his captor. A weaver could be set to produce fine textiles for trade. A thrall with medical knowledge might become a healer, valued for skills, but never granted freedom. Their expertise made them too valuable to waste on simple toil, but it did not erase their status as property. For many thralls, the harshest reality was not the endless work, but the lack of control over their own bodies. A master could punish, mistreat, or even kill a thrall with little consequence. The laws of the time reflected this inequality clearly. In many Norse legal codes, the value of a thrall was measured in silver, and if someone killed another man's thrall, it was considered damage to property, not murder. The penalty was compensation to the owner, not justice for the slain. Imagine living a life where the law itself declared you an object rather than a person. Women thralls faced particular hardships. Beyond domestic labor, many were forced into roles as concubines, taken by their masters without the right to refuse. Children born from such unions were often enslaved as well, their lives marked from the very first breath by the chains of their mothers. Archaeological evidence, such as skeletal remains showing signs of malnutrition or hard labor, suggests that many thralls lived difficult, shortened lives. The silence of the sagas about these women is telling. Their voices were never meant to be remembered, and yet their presence haunted every Viking household. Still, there were moments of complexity within this harsh system. Some thralls earned the trust of their masters and rose to positions of responsibility. A trusted thrall might oversee the work of others, manage livestock, or even handle trade on behalf of his owner. In rare cases, thralls could be freed, a process known as manumission. A freed thrall became a freedman, or leisingi in Old Norse, and although they were no longer slaves, they did not immediately become equal to other free people. Freedmen owed obligations to their former masters and carried a social stigma that might linger for generations. Nevertheless, freedom offered a faint glimmer of hope, however distant it seemed for most. The dream of freedom was sometimes woven into the stories of thralls themselves. Take, for instance, the accounts preserved in medieval laws and sagas, where thralls occasionally appear not as voiceless shadows, but as figures who resisted their fate. There are tales of thralls who fled their masters, vanishing into the forests or seeking shelter among other communities. Others found opportunities during raids, when the chaos of battle created a chance to escape. For most, such dreams ended in recapture or punishment. But the very fact that escape stories existed reveals that even in the darkest of conditions, the human spirit still sought liberty. Beyond Scandinavia itself, the world of Viking slavery stretched outward like the rivers and seas the Norse navigated. Slave trading centers dotted Europe, and the Viking network tied them together. The city of Dublin, under Viking control, became one of the largest hubs for the trade of human beings in the West. Captives from Ireland, Britain, and the Frankish lands were brought there, sold to the highest bidder, and transported to new fates. Some were sent deeper into Viking territory, while others traveled far beyond. The rivers of Eastern Europe carried Viking traders southward into the lands of the Slavs, and from there Thralls were funneled into the markets of Byzantium and even the Islamic world. It is chilling to think that a child taken from a village in Ireland might, within a year, find themselves enslaved in a distant city on the shores of the Black Sea. This human trade was not only about wealth, but also about power. Slaves were a resource that could be exchanged for silver, weapons, and luxuries. When a Viking raiding party returned home with captives, they brought not just trophies, but currency that could sustain their communities. This trade connected the Viking world to a vast network of economies, making slavery one of the engines of the Norse age. Behind every gleaming hoard of silver, every proud longhouse filled with goods, lay the shadow of those who had been bought and sold. And yet, for all its importance, slavery in Viking society often remains overlooked in modern retellings. Why? Perhaps because it shatters the romantic image we prefer to hold. The brave seafarers, the explorers, the adventurers. It is uncomfortable to remember that their wealth and freedom often rested on the suffering of others. Perhaps because the Thralls themselves left no written record, their voices erased by time, leaving only fragments for archaeologists and historians to piece together. Whatever the reason, the silence surrounding their lives speaks volumes. But silence should not be mistaken for insignificance. Thralls were there in every corner of Viking life. They worked in the fields that fed the free. They crafted the goods that filled the markets. They rowed the ships that carried warriors across seas. They stood in the halls of kings, silent but ever present. They were sacrificed at funerals, buried in graves not their own. To ignore them is to miss half of the Viking story. And if we are willing to look closely, we find hints of their humanity breaking through the cracks of history. A burial site in Denmark reveals the skeleton of a young woman, likely a thrall, buried alongside the family she served. Though her status was low, someone chose to place her in the ground with care. In Icelandic sagas, a handful of thralls are given names, rare glimpses of individuality in a sea of anonymity. These fragments remind us that thralls were not faceless masses. They were people with hopes and fears whose lives mattered even if the world sought to forget them. As our journey continues, we will explore more deeply the question of freedom. How some thralls found release from bondage, how others remained trapped across generations, and how the institution of slavery eventually began to fade as Christianity and new social systems transformed the North. For now, remember this. The Viking Age, often celebrated for its bold spirit of independence, was also an age of captivity. The Thralls, though silent in the sagas, whisper to us still from the shadows of history. Freedom for a thrall was both a dream and a complicated reality. In the Norse world, manumission, the act of freeing a slave, did exist, though it was far from common. A thrall who had served faithfully might be released by a generous master, sometimes as a gesture of goodwill or piety. In certain cases, a thrall could even buy their own freedom if they managed to save enough wealth. Though this was an extraordinary feat given their limited means, freedom might also come at the end of a master's life. Some wills included provisions to free long-serving thralls, granting them liberty as a final reward. For the enslaved, these small cracks in the system represented glimmers of hope, though faint and uncertain. Yet freedom was not an equal path. A freed thrall became a leisingi, or freedman, but their new status carried limitations. Though no longer property, they remained socially marked by their past. In many cases, they owed obligations to their former master and their family, forming a bond of dependence that was hard to sever. Their children might grow up free, but the shadow of slavery clung to their bloodline for generations. Even liberty then came with strings attached. For some, it was a new life. For others, it was merely a different kind of servitude. Despite the risks, some thralls chose not to wait for manumission. Flight was a desperate but real possibility. Runaway thralls appear in medieval law codes, which describe the punishments for those who attempted to harbor or help them. A thrall who fled faced a world where every stranger could be a potential captor. Yet the dream of escape must have burned fiercely for some. We can imagine them slipping into the forests under the cover of night, following rivers, or seeking out distant settlements where no one knew their name. The price of failure was brutal. Recapture often meant harsh punishment or even death. Still, the fact that laws addressed runaways suggests that attempts were common enough to trouble masters across Scandinavia. In rare cases, thralls resisted not with flight, but with violence. The sagas, though often silent about enslaved people, occasionally hint at darker tales. There are references to thralls who killed their masters, either in desperation or revenge. Such acts were shocking violations of the social order, and punishment was swift, but they remind us that beneath the surface of submission lay the simmering potential for rebellion. For most, the chains were too heavy, but history never fully extinguishes the sparks of defiance. The most haunting role thralls played, however, was in the realm of ritual and death. Archaeological discoveries across Scandinavia have uncovered graves where thralls were sacrificed to accompany their masters into the afterlife. In Oseberg, one of the richest Viking ship burials ever found, the remains of 2 women were laid to rest with extraordinary treasures, and nearby, the remains of servants who may have been killed to join them on their journey to the next world. Other graves show evidence of strangulation, decapitation, or stabbing, all signs of ritual killing. These sacrifices were not random violence, they were acts meant to demonstrate loyalty, honor, and power. The most vivid descriptions come from Arab chroniclers who encountered Vikings along the rivers of Eastern Europe. One such account, written by Ahmad ibn Fadlan in the 10th century, describes a funeral where a slave girl was chosen to die with her master. She was given wine, dressed in fine clothes, and eventually strangled and stabbed as part of the ceremony before her body was laid beside his in a burning ship. This chilling record, written by an outsider, provides a rare glimpse into a practice that Scandinavian sources often omit. For the thrall, death in this manner was not an act of choice, but of subjugation carried to its ultimate end. Yet even in death, the humanity of thralls breaks through the silence. Archaeologists studying these graves note details that suggest care and ritual, not mere disposal. The sacrifice of a thrall was seen as valuable, a gesture of respect for the master, though it cost the enslaved everything. In a grim sense, it reflects just how deeply ingrained slavery was in the spiritual as well as social fabric of Viking society. But history is not static, and the story of Viking slavery did not remain unchanged. Beginning in the late 10th and 11th centuries, as Christianity spread across Scandinavia, the institution of slavery began to shift. The new religion brought with it a moral framework that was, at least in theory, less accepting of human bondage. While slavery had existed in Christian Europe as well, the Church increasingly discouraged it, particularly the enslavement of fellow Christians. Over time, this pressure eroded the foundations of Norse slavery. Laws began to change. By the High Middle Ages, many regions of Scandinavia moved away from outright slavery, replacing it with systems of serfdom or tenancy. Thralls were gradually absorbed into the lower classes of free peasants, still bound by obligations but no longer legally considered property. The transition was slow, uneven, and filled with contradictions, but it marked the beginning of the end for the thrall as a distinct social category. The decline of slavery also reflected economic changes. As Viking raids subsided and Scandinavia shifted toward settled kingdoms and Christian monarchies, the flow of captives from foreign lands diminished. Trade networks changed, and the labor needs of society evolved. Without the constant influx of new slaves, the system could not sustain itself indefinitely. By the 13th century, slavery had all but disappeared from the north, leaving behind only traces in law codes and memory. Still, the legacy of thralls remained. Families once enslaved could rise to freedom over generations, but the social stigma lingered. Stories of thralls persisted in folklore, often as cautionary tales or moral lessons. The very word thrall survived in language. In English, enthrall or enthralled carries echoes of captivity, even if we rarely think about its origins. Every time the word is spoken, it whispers faintly of the countless lives lived in bondage during the Viking Age. To understand the Vikings fully, we must hold both truths together: the daring explorers who sailed to new worlds, and the enslaved men and women who made their voyages possible. Without the thralls, there would have been fewer ships, fewer farms to sustain raiding parties, fewer riches to trade. The sagas may celebrate the heroes, but behind the heroes stood a host of forgotten lives. As the Viking Age ended and the old gods gave way to Christianity, the silence of the thralls deepened. Their voices were never written down, their names mostly lost. And yet, through bones in graves, fragments in laws, and scattered accounts from foreign eyes, we can still sense them. They remind us that history is not only the story of kings and warriors, but also of those who toiled unseen. The tale of the Thralls is not one of triumph, but of endurance. It is a reminder that even in ages celebrated for adventure and glory, there were always those whose lives were overshadowed by chains. And though their names are gone, their presence remains, echoing softly through the sagas of silence. When we think of the Vikings, we imagine roaring seas, steel clashing on shields, and ships gliding across endless horizons. It is a picture painted by sagas, carved on rune stones, and reinforced by centuries of storytelling. Yet beneath this grand narrative lies a quieter, grimmer truth: that Viking greatness was built, in no small part, on the backs of the enslaved. Without thralls, the Viking Age, as we know it, could not have existed. Thralls were the hidden workforce of Norse society. They farmed the fields that fed raiders, forged the goods that fueled trade, and endured the drudgery that allowed free men to fight, explore, and govern. Their presence was not incidental but fundamental. A Viking household without thralls would have been far less capable of sustaining wealth, prestige, and expansion. If we strip slavery out of the Viking Age, much of its story collapses. And yet, in most popular images of the Vikings, thralls are invisible. Sagas rarely mention them except in passing. Medieval writers, focused on kings, jarls, and warriors, paid little attention to those who tilled the earth or carried water. Archaeology uncovers traces: shackled skeletons, sacrificial remains, poorly provisioned graves. But these are fragments, not voices. The thralls themselves left nothing in writing, nothing in song, nothing that could carry their story forward. They were silenced not only in life, but in history. This silence is not unique to the Vikings. Across the world, enslaved peoples have often been erased from memory, their contributions hidden beneath the exploits of their masters. What makes the Norse case striking is how completely the mythology of Viking freedom has overshadowed the reality of Viking bondage. Modern fascination with Vikings tends to emphasize their independence, their egalitarian spirit, their fearless individuality. But for every free farmer raising a horn of mead, there may have been 1, 2, or even 3 thralls who had no choice in their labor or their fate. The Viking dream of freedom rested upon the denial of freedom to others. It is tempting to imagine that thralls were always foreigners, captured monks from Lindisfarne, Slavic villagers from the Baltic coast, or unlucky rivals taken in war. Many were. Viking raids swept up men, women, and children from Britain, Ireland, Francia, and beyond, flooding northern markets with human lives. But not all thralls came from abroad. Some were native-born Scandinavians, reduced to slavery through debt, crime, or misfortune. Poverty could push a free family to sell a child. Conviction of theft could strip a man of his liberty. The institution of slavery was woven into the fabric of Norse law, not just the spoils of Viking raiding. In this, the Viking world was not so different from others. Slavery was a near-universal institution in the early medieval period. What makes the Norse case distinct is its brutality combined with its invisibility. Unlike the Roman Empire, which left vast records of slaves' presence, or the later transatlantic system that reshaped continents, Viking slavery is harder to see. It has no literature written from below, no plantation ruins to walk through. Its scale was smaller, its traces more fleeting, but for those who lived and died as thralls, the weight of bondage was no less crushing. Still, the thralls mattered. Their labor carved the runes of history, even if their names are lost. Think of the great Viking ships, the pride of Norse engineering, marvels of wood and sail. Who felled the trees, hauled the logs, tarred the planks? Free men may have overseen the work, but thralls surely bore much of the burden. Consider the bustling marketplaces of Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang, where goods from across the known world changed hands. Who carried those goods, unloaded them from ships, managed the stalls? Again, thralls likely made the commerce flow. Even in the rich burials of kings and queens, the remains of sacrificed servants remind us that glory at the top was made possible by suffering at the bottom. Their legacy is even preserved in language. The Old Norse word thrall, meaning slave, passed into English as thrall. To be in thrall or enthralled still carries echoes of captivity. In Scandinavian languages, too, similar words survive as reminders of this long history. Every time we use these words, we unwittingly preserve a fragment of the thrall's existence. A ghost in language, whispering of chains long gone. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the thralls is in what they teach us about freedom. The Vikings are often celebrated as lovers of liberty, unwilling to bow to kings, quick to form councils called things where free men could voice their will. Yet that liberty was exclusive. It was defined by contrast. To be free meant not being a thrall. The thralls were the silent boundary that gave meaning to freedom for others. Their lack of rights, their lack of autonomy, made the privileges of the free shine brighter. In this way, slavery was not just an economic system, but a cultural one, shaping how the Norse understood hierarchy, honor, and liberty itself. As Christianity spread across Scandinavia, it did more than end pagan rites and topple wooden idols. It reshaped the very fabric of society. The institution of slavery slowly crumbled, replaced by serfdom and tenancy. It was not immediate, nor was it purely driven by morality. Economic shifts played a large role. But over the centuries, the identity of the thrall dissolved into other categories. By the late Middle Ages, the word had largely fallen silent. For the descendants of thralls, this may have been liberation, but it was also erasure. Their ancestors' struggles slipped into obscurity, hidden under the broader sweep of history. Today, As we reconstruct the Viking world in museums, books, films, and television, we face a choice. We can celebrate the daring voyages, the artistry of their ships, the poetry of their skalds, and we should. But we must also remember the Thralls. Their story complicates the myth of the noble free Viking. It forces us to see the Norse world not as a simple saga of heroes, but as a society built on inequality, exploitation, and suffering, as well as courage and adventure. To remember the Thralls is to honor the full truth of the past. It is to give voice, however faintly, to those who were denied it in life. And in doing so, we remind ourselves that every golden age has its shadows, every story of glory its victims. The Thralls of the Vikings may remain nameless, but they are not forgotten. Their toil, their endurance, their silent presence shaped a world that still fascinates us today. The next time you picture a Viking ship cutting across the sea, imagine also the unseen hands that built it. The next time you hear of a chieftain buried with riches, remember the lives sacrificed to follow him into death. The next time you think of Viking freedom, recall that it stood upon unfree shoulders. History, after all, is not only the story of the conquerors, but of the conquered, not only of those who ruled, but also of those who served. And so the Thralls remain with us. In language, in archaeology, in the dim echoes of chronicles written by outsiders. They are shadows on the edge of the Viking flame, reminders that no age is as simple as legend makes it. The Vikings may have sailed boldly into history, but the Thralls were bound to their oars. Both belong to the story, and both deserve to be remembered.